You notice we moved him from yesterday to today, and I just met him outside, and the poor guy is like jet lagged. He's doing a great job for us here. He flew in from Europe, got in late last night, struggling a little bit, but he's fired up and ready to go. He works out of Cincinnati, and I think a big part of, obviously, if you know GE in terms of the things they do great work on the analytics side, and so what he's going to share with you is a little bit more about some of the quantitative approach that they're using at GE Aviation around talent management. So without further ado, all the way from Europe and jet-lagged, Mr. Ross Sparkman. Ross.
So I'll try not to fall asleep up here. I've learned three things probably in the last couple of years with regards to talent analytics, workforce planning, my time at GE. First thing that I've learned is that the HR function has a long ways to go in terms of scaling their competence in analytics, understanding how we can leverage that to increase company performance. It's the first thing I've learned. The second thing I learned is that there is a large disconnect between how we use predictive analytics and analytics in general in the context of the people space to drive performance. Now, what do I mean by that? If we take a step back in sort of a capitalist view, and I'm not a capitalist view type of a kind of guy, but again, in the context of business, I always ask the question with the HR business partners, what are we here as an organization, as a business to do? Irrespective of social responsibility or anything like that, from a pure capitalist standpoint, what are we as an organization here to do? Increase shareholder value. At the most fundamental level. How do we increase shareholder value? Investor expectations, taking on positive net present value projects that grow other positive net value projects. How do you do that? It basically means that every decision that you make with regards to your company, whether it's in the HR function, finance function, operations, anything, should not be done without analyzing the project, analyzing what you're doing, making an informed decision based on numbers as to whether or not that project's going to add value. So I have this conversation with a lot of people across the organization, and they're just like, you're out to lunch and this and that. And that's very, very, very sort of high level, but it kind of gives you a little bit of a background around why, when we think about our people and we think about the HR function, we would want to use big data to make more informed decisions. So we, as the HR function, who for the most part owns the most expensive asset on the balance sheet, can truly be a player at the strategy table. That's the second thing I've learned in the last couple of years. The third thing I've learned, and this was probably last night when I arrived in Miami, is that I want to live in Miami a lot more than Cincinnati because it's just great weather. That's a no-brainer. So we're going to talk a little bit today about, this is going to be more in the context of workforce planning and how we can use big data to optimize the talent mix to drive performance, and that's sort of speaking to the end of wanting to really truly contribute to the bottom line, essentially. Problem statement. When I started at GE Aviation a couple years ago, we had started going down the road of predictive analytics. We had developed a nice little framework around how to approach workforce planning. And what we basically did was sort of create an attrition model and understand what the gaps in our future workforce would look like based on attrition, then plug in the op plan finance numbers for demand and come up with a nifty little gap. And it was actually pretty revolutionary at the time for what we were doing, because we just had no insight into how to leverage any kind of data to make better decisions like that. And this gave us the opportunity to sort of do that in a 3, 4, 5 year time frame. It was interesting though, because I was, in my first couple of months in the role, I was having some conversations with some of the business leaders. I had a conversation with the CFO, and we were talking about, again, this notion of driving performance. And he said, this is great. You've done a great job mitigating risk. This is a great job mitigating risk. We know now that there's risk profiles out for certain talent segments based on attrition, and potentially now we can say, okay, well, we need to target this area in the workforce, and we are, better apt to do that now. But he said, okay, that speaks to sort of 25% of what I'm interested in. I want to know how I can drive performance, how I can get more out of my workforce, because the investors want to see us grow our margins. We want to see us reduce our costs and input our productivity. Help me understand how what you're doing today can do that. So great job with the risk mitigation piece. You're doing good. But now tell me how we can take this a step further and use it to optimize our workforce. And it's just like lights went off. It was an epiphany, like, okay, this is what kind of sort of it's all about, really, right? How can we develop a framework now that goes from just risk mitigation, which is, again, still a big part of it, to driving performance, to, by taking a talent mix today and optimizing it. So the problem statement basically was, how do we take our current mix of workers, skills, competencies, contingent workers, et cetera, versus internal hires, external hires, understand what that mix needs to look like tomorrow to increase our efficiency. And that was what the hypothesis of the test was in the problem statement. Like, how do we do this? And that was sort of what started us down the road of developing a workforce optimization strategy. Our traditional approach to workforce planning was, I think, probably something that anybody who's been in this space is fairly familiar with. We started by looking across the organization, defining what the critical talent segments were. So in other words, who are the people that, if they didn't show up tomorrow, would be likely to actually impact our ability to execute on our strategy. HR doesn't show up tomorrow, probably nobody's going to notice. Our manufacturing engineers don't show up tomorrow, people are going to notice, right? It's the 20-80 rule. So let's start with what are the critical segments that we actually need to look at. And we did a good job of that. And again, that speaks to the risk mitigation piece. We were able to say, okay, manufacturing engineers are 4% higher in attrition than some of the other talent segments. Let's focus on them and develop strategies around retaining them. Second part then was, once we had defined these talent segments, we basically said, okay, let's do some supply and demand forecasting to understand how many people we'll need in these talent segments in the future and how many people are going to leave in the future, so we can understand and plan for backfilling and for hiring incremental demand. And it was interesting, just listening to that last conversation, the demand piece was really driven by business drivers. That's a whole separate presentation that was really also profound, because we were able to align how we did our future demand forecasting based off of key aspects of the income statement, balance statement, and business drivers. So it was no longer just sort of based off of finance, but it was actually aligned and directly proportional to key business drivers, which was great. Again, this was all really good stuff. Then we look at the gaps, and we'd say, oh, this is really good. We note the gaps. We've aligned the workforce with the overarching strategy. This is where we need to plan. This is where the growth is going to be. This is where we can expect attrition. Awesome stuff, really good stuff. We've mitigated a lot of risk. We've aligned the workforce with our strategy. We're patting ourselves on the back. We're thinking we're really doing a good job here. And then take action. So now we can say, okay, let's take action and use that intel to drive risk mitigation strategies. At the time, we were thinking performance strategies, but if you start to think about it, was it performance strategies or was it just mitigating risk? How it worked basically was, and I kind of spoke to this a few minutes ago, is we would use big data. We would develop a supply projection. You cannot see? Right here? Is that better? Okay, you're there? Okay. We can then develop a supply projection to say, where we need the people, demand projection, where the demand was coming from, and roll it all up to a nice little package, and it was great. Everybody loved it. Can anybody think about, though, in the context of that, where the pitfall would be? This is an open dialogue, too. If anybody has questions, just jump in. What might the problem with that be? I mean, it sounds pretty... That's exactly, that could be one thing, right? Because what you're doing today, you're planning today for a talent mix, the same talent mix today for tomorrow. So that could be one aspect, but let's say you had a suboptimal talent mix. Let's say all the projections that you were doing with your workforce, that you were planning for the backfill, that you were planning for the incremental demand was not right. It was suboptimal. So you were only maybe 60% fully productive. Well, what level of productivity are you going to have tomorrow then, 3 years from now, if you're just planning for the same thing? You've mitigated the risk. You're going to be able to have the same talent structure in place, but probably not going to drive a lot of shareholder value, right? Because you haven't done anything. You've just mitigated the risk. You've taken the current workforce and planned for that same current workforce tomorrow. And that's what I think that our CFO was getting at. He didn't say that we had a suboptimal talent mix, but he wanted to know how can we improve it, or how can we at least understand what that mix looks like in the context of driving performance. So you're taking your mix today, doing this great analysis, and then taking that mix and extrapolating it into the future. You haven't done anything to the actual workforce, right? You've done a lot of risk mitigation. Again, that's a big piece, but. So this was when we started going down the road and started to think a lot about, well, how can we take workforce planning and analytics and go into this sort of 2.0 space? We had the discussion, and there was a lot of key questions that we asked around, what are the drivers that would potentially impact that mix. We talked a lot about the future growth of the business, how, like you said, the talent segments today might be different in the future. This was kind of a laundry list of 9 questions that we sort of asked. These were also some of the questions that we asked when we were defining what the business drivers were. But it started getting everybody in the room and at least having a discussion around how could we possibly do this. We had questions like, how would the business mix and the product mix change impact our talent mix? How would expansion into emerging markets affect our talent mix? How would improved economy and increased attrition impact our ability to execute? What's the cost of the workforce today? How can we lower that cost of the workforce? How do contingent workers play into the mix? Internal labor versus external labor. Are we hiring too many external people or not enough? These are the questions that we started to talk about that were driving the dialogue. So then we kind of put the slide together to think about if we were to create an optimized talent mix, we would no longer have a mix today that looks the same tomorrow, but we would actually be able to exponentially increase our ability to execute, because we'd have people that were wanting to do what they wanted to do because we really truly had them in the right roles. We were a lot more nimble and flexible. We had executed and given better training, and we were even more aligned with the workforce. So you can see this is obviously a very hypothetical curve, exponential curve that went up in terms of our productivity. So now let's talk about sort of how we started down the road, what we actually did to try to quantify this. Let's talk a little bit about the science. I'm going to go a little bit deeper dive, just because of this audience, around sort of some of the approaches that we took. And then we'll kind of wrap it up, and we can talk about some of the pitfalls, challenges, et cetera, that we faced. So the first thing that we really wanted to do was, this is all centered around productivity, right? With the notion that more productive workforce at a lower cost would drive that efficiency that we were looking for. And we needed to understand what are some of the relevant productivity metrics. And this was largely a discussion with business leaders, and we came up with a huge list depending upon what talent segment we were looking at. We would use a different productivity lever or productivity metric, but some of the key metrics that we thought about were essentially engines produced to headcount, parts produced to headcount, new contracts to headcount, revenue to headcount, and there was probably 60 different metrics that we came up with as potential proxies for driving productivity. That was the first thing that we did, so we defined those. Then what we needed to do was to develop a hypothesis around what different levers now, productivity levers are out there that would improve those ratios or improve that productivity. And this is where we really started to get into the science, and this was the more challenging part, because we had to start thinking more along the lines of doing a deep dive, looking at all the available data that we had, trying to include everybody's feedback, and then testing it and coming up with valid statistical assumptions that actually made sense. So what we basically did was, some of the ones that we came up with, or the key ones that we came up with, were internal to external hires, so a ratio of internal to external hires in the context of driving productivity, full-time employees to contingent employees, training spend to performance scores, and then regrettable and non-regrettable attrition. So these were what we kind of come up with as our hypothesis around these likely, given the optimal mix, could potentially drive improved performance, which were those metrics. So increase those metrics if we got these mixes right. So what we needed to do then was to validate them statistically, and this is where we really did a deep dive. We did a lot of mixed model GLM statistics to come up with a regression model or regression models that basically were correlated between that productivity metrics that we had defined and those different levers. So if we had a ratio of 0.7 for the internal external hire, we look back historically, as that ratio changed, how did that lever we defined change? Was there a positive association with it? And we found that there was in a lot of these cases. What that allowed us to do then was create a function that or a regression model that basically said, if we want to increase productivity via reducing attrition, how much attrition will we have to decrease to see X percentage increase in productivity? So it allowed us to do a lot of sensitivity analysis and provided us with the framework for the next part of the optimization model. This was obviously really challenging to do with people within the HR community, so we had to partner a lot with some of our operations experts and engineers to validate it and come up with agreements on what would make the most sense. In terms of statistics, they were all validated at a p-value of 0.05 and fairly significant. If it was a logistic regression, we wouldn't use the R-square, but if it was a linear, we would with a probably R-square above 0.7. So that's why when I said we used the mixed models, we used different models depending upon if it was attrition, we use a logistic or a Poisson regression, and if it was one of the other ones, we might use linear. So now the next part was taking those inputs and developing a linear programming model. This is where we were actually going to now optimize, based on those outputs, a model that would tell us specifically how many people we would need, how much training spend we would need, what the ratio of internal to external workers would need, and we would do this with the constraint that we would only use X number of dollars of spend. In other words, if we hadn't put a constraint on spend, it would just basically say, go out and spend a bazillion dollars, have a 15 billion person workforce, because there's no cost constraint. So we layered in a cost constraint into this piece. And for our objective function, we basically said that if our current productivity ratio based on all those slides that I just showed you was 8, we would set it to 10 and let the model do its magic and show us then the output would be what we would have to do from an external to internal hires mix, from a reduction in regrettable attrition and an increase potentially in non-regrettable attrition, et cetera, et cetera. So the model basically took all the inputs, everything that we had done, optimized it, and gave us an output around what we should have in our current workforce to increase our productivity by that 2. And what does that 2 mean? Well, that's another discussion. But it basically, if you look at this model, these are not real. I put dummy numbers in here, but this is the initial, what we had was 8. Our total workforce cost was about 13.5 million. and the mix was, training spend was X number of dollars, full-time workers was say 100, contingent work was 40, regrettable attrition was 10%, non-regrettable attrition, that number's wrong, is 6%. And internal hires 10, external hires 2, and then the total cost of that was 13.4 million. After we plugged in the numbers and let the model run, what we were able to do was essentially change that total mix. Now our new productivity would be 10. Our total cost of the workforce would be significantly lower at 10.1 million. External hires, you saw, went up quite a bit. So we're now essentially saying that rather than going and building, we want to buy a lot more of a workforce because we get people on the back end with a lot more experience. You can see that obviously we wanted to increase our non-regrettable attrition by a lot and decrease our regrettable attrition. So we wanted to keep our key performers, and we wanted to get the people that weren't our key performers out of the door. Contingent workforce, we increased quite a bit from 40 to 60. So we wanted to be a more nimble workforce. They're a lot cheaper and allow us to also take into account and mitigate some of the risk around the cyclicality of our business. And then training spend, we essentially increased it. So not surprisingly, more training develops more skills, more competencies, makes our workforce better. And then our actual full-time workers went down by 10. And I mean, right there you can say, well, you said that you want your non-regrettable attrition to go up and your overall workforce to go down. There it is right there. There's your 10 people. This is when now HR jumps in and we start to strategize. This is where we start to say, okay, you did all that crazy weird math stuff. You've given me some actual tangible numbers that I can work with. Now, how do I go and decrease my attrition in my regrettable attrition? Let's focus on those individuals as being the ones that we want to retain. Internal, external hires, pretty simple. Let's look more externally for some of these roles. What we were finding basically was that when we were growing people, we were spending a lot of money and a lot of opportunity cost with them getting caught up to speed, and then they would leave. So we trained them and they would leave, which is clearly quite suboptimal. So this is saying, okay, well, maybe we don't need to do that much building. Let's go to the external market and buy. We now have workers who have experience, who probably left their last workforce because they were doing the same thing that our new people are doing, right? They got trained up and they were ready to leverage that experience. So these are basically levers. These are basically levers that you're able to now start to pull to develop an optimal workforce mix, to drive shareholder value, true quantitative metrics that are now in place. It's nothing that's sort of, well, maybe if we did this, it would. No, this is like, here's the regression, here's the statistics, here's the optimization model, here's the math. We can show this to our CFO. And now suddenly the conversation is a little bit different than it was before. Benefits. Obviously, clearly a more efficient workforce. You have cross-pollination of talent. You have people that are able to move throughout the organization better, more alignment with our overarching strategy. Job satisfaction and more focused training are just a few of the benefits to being able to take this type of approach. Challenges. Now, clearly there were a lot of challenges. This is a complete paradigm shift for how we thought about the workforce. I mean, this is really, really Moneyball type stuff. And a lot of that's still not necessarily something that a lot of people are comfortable with. It's complex, clearly, very complex. There's not a lot of people that are able to understand how this works, right? So there's always a fine line between, how do you present this to an audience? How deep do you go? Because a lot of times if you go too deep, you're going to lose people, but if you don't go deep enough, you're going to lose credibility because you haven't articulated exactly what you did to come up with this new talent mix. There's always sort of this discussion around how does this benefit me? If we go and we have all these dialogues and discussions and I totally change the paradigm in the way that we're operating, what's the end impact to me? What's the net positive to me? What's my utility in all this? And these are just typical change management things that we often all have to struggle with. And then there's just the language. Are we all talking about the same thing here with workforce planning and analytics and talent management? What is the intersection there? There's a lot of confusion in the organization about what specifically talent management was, what workforce planning is, what workforce analytics is. There's a lot of new terminology that's out there that people may not understand. So there was a lot of level setting in terms of getting people to actually talk the same language. It's just that simple. And then there's the regional piece. I was just in Italy. We had a big acquisition over there, and the way that certain areas and certain, I guess, levers that they would consider to be talent mix levers are totally different over there. Attrition's totally different over there. The economic situation in Europe is totally different, right? So depending upon if you're talking about China, where attrition is 12% because of the workforce, versus Europe where it's 2%, there's a lot of different assumptions that have to be made. Senior level buy-in is the number one key success factor. So when you can go and talk to your CFO and he's the guy that essentially gave you the epiphany, that's a good thing. It's a bad thing though when his counterpart in HR is an old school generalist that maybe doesn't want to do this, right? So there's the typical sort of two sides. And then, of course, the new way of thinking. In GE, we have a very tenured, mature workforce. So it's not uncommon to see people that have been doing the same thing for 35 years, right? People, in HR didn't necessarily get in HR to be statisticians. There's people that haven't picked up a textbook in 35 years in HR, let alone an operations management textbook, right? So it's a lot for a lot of people to swallow. It takes them out of their comfort zone a lot of the time. There's issues with job security, with the way HR is changing, with new expectations of HR that people sometimes feel inadequate, maybe. And so you have to circumvent that also. So lessons learned, start small. The way we did this was with a really small little talent segment to show proof of concept. Scope, start small. Again, everything definitely starts small. Don't try to go and tackle the world with something like this because you're bound to fail. Change management is absolutely essential in this. You have to understand who your stakeholders are, who you need to influence, who you need to partner with, who will be keen and who will not be keen on doing something like this. Because if you don't, then again, you're just setting yourself up for failure. And then strategy alignment. You're going to get the executive support per our CFO if you're aligned with the strategy, if you're talking the same language as they are. If you're not, if you're just doing things that you think are aligned to the strategy but you haven't quantified, there could be some issues potentially or roadblocks that you might face. So that's sort of the down and dirty. Does anybody have questions on any of this stuff? Has anybody seen or had experience with taking the workforce and trying to optimize the talent mix? We can talk about other things too, because this is just one part of what we do. We do all types of stuff with analytics. So, yes.
One challenge I had is you have to sometimes factor in the investment in equipment.
Yeah.
Productivity would be with technology.
Yeah.
Where that is, where that's impact.
That's a great question.
Process improvement and investments. Do you have to negotiate?
Oh, so much. That's exactly. I mean, that, and right there alone, one of the things with us is we're really getting into additive manufacturing. So we've literally only been doing it for 2 years, and pretty much everybody has only been doing it for 2 years. So what that's going to look like 5 years from now in the context of productivity, it could quadruple our productivity. So there are some assumptions that you have to make, and that's, I think, when you get into having the workshops and having all the right stakeholders in the room around defining, what the levers are and what those metrics are, you have to do, because at the end of the day, there are going to be some assumptions around that. It's a great question. Yeah. Yes. Hey. Hey. Hey, how's it going?
Paradigm change going from the competition between managers making decisions and models making decisions. So managers are subjective, flexible, models are objective,
Yes.
somewhat rigid, always need human input to run
Yes.
the model. So at what level do you use the model? Is it at the planning at the entire organization, or do you have coefficients that you can use at the plant level or business unit level? What are you actually?
So I would say for this, we're going to use it at a site level. Smaller, we segment the workforce. So for a plant, we would segment maybe there's 1,000 people in that plant. We would segment that workforce into, say, 5 different areas. So maybe 200, people in each of those 5 different areas. And then for those 200 people, we would apply a model like this. And depending upon what the productivity metrics were for that 200 people, in other words, if it's manufacturing in Terre Haute, Indiana, we would have had the discussion and used the relevant productivity driver for that. So we do it at a very granular level right now. There's a lot of complexity there, like per being in Italy, per being in China, per being in Alabama versus Yakima, Washington. I find that this works better. The model actually itself is fairly simplistic. Once you have done all the math, and it's just a linear programming model where you plug in a few things and spits out what the talent mix should be. Once it does spit out the talent mix, the optimal talent mix, that's when you have to just start strategizing and saying, okay, what makes the most sense?
Just one follow-up question.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a lag between the input variables
Yes.
and the output? And
Yes.
Is that,
Depending upon what the variables are, I'd say there's probably 2 to 3 year lag at time, and that's one of the key assumptions is you have to give it time to, and also because of the cyclical nature of our business, whether you're talking about the commercial business or the engineering business, the lag could be different just because you're at different parts of the business. Yeah.
Okay, great. Other questions? Right here. Okay.
So you were using the model, obviously, to look at the drivers of productivity and then in for the right talent mix. This just brought to my mind, whenever I've done productivity analysis, completed one, there's one that I'm working on. The issue comes up of normative data. How do you know whether this is good or bad? And that's easier in some industries and some functions and not so easy in other industries, other functions. I don't know if that's an issue you've encountered.
Right.
At all in your business?
So that was the key issue, and that's why when we developed those, what we considered to be the key drivers, we went and we used the statistics then to quantify it by using a regression analysis to figure out if it was statistically significant. In other words, if we thought that external/internal hires was a lever, we would calculate the ratio out over time, month by month, for the past 5 years. Then we would regress that against what the other lever was, whether it was parts to headcount, and see what the relationship was, so we could actually quantify it. Because that's always the question that you hear is, hey, it's a little bit nice, No, this is what the statistics are saying. I'll leave it up to you to decide whether or not you want to use them or not. That's the way we positioned it.
Yeah, the question that I always get, and I'm sure people in this room get, is how does that compare with others? How do other companies compare on
Great question.
parts per engineer or whatever the metric is?
And I would ask them, have they done any type of statistical analysis? Maybe we get together, we can compare what their outputs were. Because you wouldn't think that they would be that much different unless there was a lot more efficiency in certain organizations. And then right there in itself, you can say, okay, well, here's another opportunity. Right? Sorry, how am I doing for time?
Oh, you're good. You're
Okay.
good. You're golden. Other questions? Any other questions? Right here. Okay.
If I understood correctly, you said that you basically changed the ratio of internal to external and flipped it, but then you spent more money on training. What did you spend the money on training for if you were buying the skill sets that you needed?
Yeah, that's a good question. And again, that was kind of part of the complexity. The model basically said that if you wanted to, have this cost constraint at this percentage, spend this much on training and spend this much on external hires. What we did was, because we had less internal people that we were developing now, we were able to focus more specifically on, we also did a skills gap inventory. So the critical skills that we had defined as being levers in themselves, and focus specifically on those skills. So if we were looking at engineering workforce and there was maybe, CAD, some type of, because we're going into, additive manufacturing, focus specifically on that area, and you're going to be able to get a lot more bang for your buck. Yeah.
Okay, great. Time for one last question. Any other questions? No? Okay, Ross, thanks so much.
Thanks a lot, guys.
Appreciate it.